In 2015, an ancestor surfaced in the DNA of indigenous people from the Amazon rainforest. A population that left its genes behind in South America thousands of years ago, then vanished so completely that we didn't even know it existed. And according to the old story of how the Americas were settled, their existence is impossible. A genetic signal, small but unmistakable. A piece of ancestry in some native South American populations that didn't match the expected pattern. This ancestry wasn't closest to other Native Americans or to Siberians or to East Asians. It was more closely related to Aboriginal Australians, Papuans, and the Onga people of the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. The geneticists named it Population Y from Ipaikuera, meaning ancestor in Tupi, an indigenous language family of South America. And since that first discovery, the signal has been confirmed in multiple independent studies, showing up consistently in genetic datasets from across the continent. But here's where it gets strange. Because Population Y isn't a tribe you can visit, it's not a community with elders who remember their history. It's a ghost, a model, an inference drawn from patterns in modern DNA. We've never found their bones, never recovered their skulls, never sequenced them directly. Population Y is what geneticists call an unsampled population, a group we can detect through their genetic legacy, but whose actual remains have never been identified. So what exactly is Population Y, and how did a piece of Australasian-like ancestry end up in the Amazon? The signal shows up today at around 1 to 3% in several South American indigenous groups, not evenly distributed, but concentrated in specific regions. The Amazon Basin, the Pacific coast of South America. Groups like the Chotuna in Peru and the Quechua in Ecuador. 1 to 3% doesn't sound like much, but in population genetics that's significant. That's a detectable, consistent signal. Not noise, not contamination, real ancestry from a real source population. And critically, it's not recent. This isn't the result of modern contact, of Australian sailors visiting South America in the colonial period, of some 19th century migration story we missed. We know it's ancient because the signal appears in very old burials. Lagoa Santa, a region in Brazil where archaeologists have excavated burial sites dating back roughly 10,000 years. The individuals buried there are clearly Native American. Their genomes cluster with other indigenous South Americans. But one individual, analysed in detail, carried about 2% of this Australasian-like signal, 10,000 years ago. Long before European contact, long before recorded history, this ancestry was already present, already part of the genetic makeup of early South Americans. That tells us Population Y is ancient, not some recent arrival or historical quirk. This is a founding component, something baked into the ancestry of native South Americans from the very beginning. But if this ancestry has been there for 10,000 years or more, the question becomes even more mysterious. How did people in South America end up sharing detectable ancestry with populations whose closest modern relatives live on remote islands in the Indian Ocean? To understand that, we need to step back and think about what the world looked like during the late Pleistocene, the Ice Age world, when humans first moved into the Americas. The old, simple story went like this. People crossed from Siberia into Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia to North America when sea levels were lower. They waited in Beringia, possibly for thousands of years, until an ice-free corridor opened through the North American ice sheets around 13,800 years ago. Then they spilled south, spreading rapidly across 2 continents. Clean, linear, one migration, one founding population, one story. But genetics never supported that simplicity. Modern DNA studies show that Native American populations have complex ancestry, multiple components, layers that can't be explained by a single homogeneous founding group. And Population Y is part of that complexity. So, where did it come from? The leading explanation is deep Asian structure. Picture the late Pleistocene world of Asia, not neat nation-states with borders and distinct populations, but small bands of hunter-gatherers scattered across vast landscapes, mixing, splitting, reconnecting, moving with the seasons, following game, adapting to shifting climates. These groups weren't isolated. They encountered each other, traded, intermarried, absorbed neighbours when groups got too small to sustain themselves. Over tens of thousands of years, this created a web of relationships, a braided stream of ancestry where clean separations didn't exist. Some of these ancestral groups were related to the Onge of the Andaman Islands, Others to Hoabinhian foragers in ancient Southeast Asia, a culture known from stone tools and cave sites. Others to Jomon-era hunter-gatherers in prehistoric Japan, the people who lived on the Japanese islands before the arrival of rice farmers from the mainland. And somewhere in that mix, some of these ancestral strands fed into the populations moving toward Beringia, the people who would eventually cross into the Americas. They didn't leave Asia as a single, genetically uniform tribe. They left already mixed, already carrying multiple ancestral components, including the population Y component. Under this model, the founding population of South America wasn't a clone army, identical people marching south. It was a heterogeneous group, people with different ancestry proportions, some carrying more of the population Y strand, others carrying less. And as those groups spread across the Americas, some branches kept more of that ancestry than others, particularly groups that moved down the Pacific coast and then inland into the Amazon. That would explain why population Y shows up in South America. But it creates another puzzle. Why don't we see it in the north? So far, population Y ancestry hasn't been detected in northern Native American groups, not in First Nations communities in Canada, not in tribes across the United States, not in Mesoamerica. That absence is strange. If population Y was part of the founding ancestry of the Americas, why does it only show up in the South? There are three possible explanations, and each one points to a different story about how the Americas were settled. First possibility: geographic sorting. Maybe the people with more population Y ancestry traveled fast down the Pacific coast and had a bigger impact in South America than in North America. Coastal migration routes following the shoreline south could have funneled specific ancestral components into South America, while different groups with different ancestry proportions stayed in the north. Second possibility: erasure. Maybe population Y ancestry used to exist in northern groups, but was wiped out by later population movements, by disease. Specific communities and their unique lineages were destroyed. And if those communities carried the population Y signal more strongly than others, its northern distribution could have been erased within the last 500 years. Third possibility: we're just missing the data. And this one is crucial because it speaks to the ethics of genetic research and the long, painful history of how indigenous peoples have been treated by science. Indigenous communities in North America, First Nations in Canada, tribes in the United States have every reason to distrust researchers. Generations of grave robbery, museums filled with stolen ancestral remains, samples taken without consent, used for purposes never explained or agreed to, broken promises, research published that contradicted oral histories, questioned identities, was used to undermine legal claims to land and sovereignty. So many communities today tightly control access to biological samples. They restrict ancient DNA studies. They demand consultation, consent, co-authorship, and the right to veto publication if the research conflicts with community values or interests. This is entirely justified, but it means the genetic data we have from northern indigenous groups is limited, self-selected toward communities that chose to participate. If population Y ancestry was present in northern populations, but those populations are undersampled in genetic studies, we wouldn't see the signal even if it's there. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It might just mean we haven't been allowed to look. And for good reason. So, the northern distribution of population Y remains an open question. We don't know if it was never there, if it was erased, or if we simply haven't detected it yet because we lack data. But whatever the answer, the presence of population Y in South America forces us to reconsider the entire timeline of how the Americas were settled. The old model said people crossed into Beringia and then waited for the ice-free corridor to open around 13,800 years ago before moving south. But archaeology increasingly contradicts that timeline. White sands in New Mexico. Fossilized human footprints preserved in ancient lake sediments, dated to approximately 21,000 years ago. People were walking across North America during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets were at their maximum extent and the corridor supposedly didn't exist yet. Chiqui White Cave in Mexico. Stone tools in deep sediment layers. Claims of occupation around 30,000 years ago. Controversial, contested, but not easily dismissed. Sites in Brazil. Claims of human presence stretching back 50,000 years or more. Most archaeologists remain skeptical of the oldest claims, but the pattern is clear. evidence keeps pushing the date of human arrival in the Americas earlier and earlier. And the alternative route, the one that allows people to reach the Americas before the ice-free corridor opened, is coastal migration. Moving south along the Pacific shoreline when sea levels were lower and now submerged coastal plains were habitable and resource-rich. That route could have brought people into South America much earlier than the inland corridor model allows. And if those coastal migrants already carried population Y ancestry when they left Asia, that would explain why it shows up in South America. But here's the key point. Population Y doesn't look like a first wave. It doesn't look like we were here first and everyone else replaced us. The Lagoa Santa genomes from 10,000 years ago show the population Y signal at only a few %. Most of the ancestry is standard Native American, clustering with other indigenous groups. That pattern suggests population Y wasn't a separate earlier migration that peopled the Americas and then got wiped out. It was one thread in a braided stream. One component among several in an already mixed founding population. Most researchers don't currently think population Y represents a lost first wave that arrived tens of thousands of years earlier and vanished everywhere except as a faint echo in the Amazon. Instead, the leading idea is that Native American ancestors arrived already admixed from Asia, carrying multiple ancestral components, including this population Y component. As those groups spread, some branches, especially those moving down the Pacific corridor and into South America, kept a bit more of that ancestry than others. That's not a replacement story, it's a sorting story. Ancestry proportions shifting as populations split and migrated, some branches drifting toward higher population Y, others drifting away from it. That's the story population Y tells. Not a simple origin, but a complex, layered, ongoing process. The kind of process that defines human history everywhere, not just in the Americas. We are not the product of clean migrations and isolated populations. We're the product of mixing, of movement, of encounters between groups, carrying different ancestries, different stories, different ways of being human. Population Y is a reminder of that. A genetic whisper from the late Pleistocene. A signal that shouldn't be there according to the old maps, but is undeniably present when you look at the data. And as genetic methods improve, as more ancient DNA is recovered, as more communities choose to participate in research on their own terms, we'll learn more, we'll refine the models, we'll narrow the possibilities, maybe we'll even find them. The actual population Y people. A burial site, a skull, a genome we can sequence directly instead of inferring from signals in other populations. Or maybe population Y will remain a ghost, a model, an unsampled lineage whose existence we infer but never directly observe. Either way, their legacy is here, written in the genomes of indigenous South Americans. A thread connecting the Amazon to the Andaman Islands across 15,000 kilometers of ocean and land. A mystery that challenges simple stories and demands we think bigger, deeper, and more globally about how the Americas were peopled. And if you want to learn more about the Americas and the latest DNA studies done in Ancestry, make sure to check out this video